In every ancient civilization, there is a place where the written record fades into silence, where even the most meticulous scribes allowed certain truths to slip between the lines. The Sumerians, the first great architects of civilization, left behind tens of thousands of clay tablets filled with accounts of kings, gods, floods, rituals, and cosmic order. Yet scattered among these texts is an unsettling sense of absence, as though an entire chapter of human history had been deliberately veiled. It is into this veil that we step, guided by echoes of a world that once stood closer to the divine than our own. The story of the Anunnaki, etched into clay yet obscured by time, rises not as mythology, but as a fractured memory waiting to be assembled. What survived in these tablets hints at a past shaped by beings who came from beyond the earthly horizon, walked among early humans, and then disappeared, leaving behind a civilization struggling to understand why the heavens had grown silent. The memory of the flood stands at the center of this silence, not merely as a natural disaster, but as a cosmic rupture that severed humanity from its former guardians. The tablets describe a world before the waters where the gods mingled freely with humans, offering knowledge, order, and guidance. After the deluge, that world was gone, replaced by a fragile new age where divine presence retreated into myth and ritual. In this shadowed landscape, early civilizations sensed that something essential had been lost. A fracture had opened between the mortal and divine realms, and its wound shaped the destiny of every culture that followed. As cities rose again on the muddy plains of Mesopotamia, people clung to memories of a vanished era, whispering of beings who once walked in radiant form before withdrawing to unreachable realms. It is from this longing that humanity's first great journeys emerged, not as quests for territory, but as searches for meaning. Sumerian kings sent emissaries across mountains and deserts, seeking lands rumored to hold remnants of pre-flood wisdom. One figure in particular rises from this early age, Enmerkar of Uruk, whose expeditions toward the mysterious land of Aratta were driven by more than trade. The texts describe Aratta not merely as a distant settlement, but as a repository of sacred knowledge preserved from an older world. Enmerkar's messengers crossed harsh landscapes to negotiate with its ruler, invoking the authority of Inanna and recalling agreements said to originate before the deluge. Whether these journeys reflect historical expeditions or encoded memories of lost connections, they reveal a civilization desperately reaching for what had slipped from its grasp. This yearning culminates in the story of Gilgamesh, whose quest transcends politics, wealth, or conquest. Haunted by the death of Enkidu, he seeks the secret of immortality held by Utnapishtim, the lone survivor of the flood. His journey takes him through places that blur the boundary between the earthly and the divine. Tunnels where sunlight never enters, shores where stone giants guard crossings, and waters described as lethal to mortals. Each step reflects humanity's attempt to breach the barrier erected after the cataclysm. Gilgamesh's pursuit is not simply a quest for eternal life, but a search for the truth of why the gods withdrew and how humanity might reclaim what was lost. Though his journey ends in sorrow, it reveals a tension that runs through all early mythologies. The sense that the divine world was once near, only to recede without explanation. Beyond these epic journeys, archaeology hints at real movements of people searching for lost knowledge. Excavations reveal trade networks expanding into the Zagros Mountains, the Indus region, and the Persian Gulf, long before such routes made economic sense. Some sites contain materials foreign to their surroundings, as though ancient travelers sought specific places tied to mythic memory. Other locations bear inscriptions referring to lands where the gods ascended, prompting both mainstream scholars and alternative researchers to wonder whether these journeys reflect attempts to trace the physical footprints of the Anunnaki. Whether literal or symbolic, these explorations reveal a civilization acting on a profound intuition. that somewhere beyond the borders of their world lay answers that had survived the collapse. What remains most striking is the emotional tone of these early accounts. They describe the world not with confidence, but with yearning, as though humanity stood in the afterglow of a brilliance it no longer understood. Across tablets and traditions, there lingers a quiet grief for beings who once shaped the world but no longer walked its plains. The quests of kings, the journeys of heroes, and the rituals of priests all point toward a single, unspoken truth. Humanity remembered the presence of the Anunnaki, but could no longer reach them. And as these memories grew dim, a new figure emerged, one who stood between the old world and the new, the keeper of secrets, who carried within him the final threads of a vanished age. But what he reveals will reshape not only the past, but the meaning of everything that followed. The great journeys that defined the early world all seem to converge toward a single enigmatic figure, one who stands like a silent monument between eras. He is the keeper of secrets, the witness who survived what others only preserved in fragments. Every ancient culture holds some echo of him, an immortal king who outlived dynasties, a sage who withdrew into isolation, a priest entrusted with forbidden knowledge, or a wanderer who returned from distant horizons carrying truths that unsettled the powerful. In Sumer, this archetype takes its clearest form in Utnapishtim, though his story is but one thread in a tapestry woven from memories far older than the tablets themselves. He represents the last direct voice of a world where the Anunnaki walked openly among humans, his existence a bridge spanning the gulf between divine presence and mortal longing. Utnapishtim's tale begins before the flood, at a time when the gods still shaped the destinies of cities and kings with personal involvement. Unlike Gilgamesh, he is not introduced as a conqueror or a hero seeking glory. He is simply a man chosen by a god who defied his own counsel. Moved by compassion or foresight, Enki warns him of the coming cataclysm and instructs him to construct a vessel unlike anything described in earlier myths. The precision of its dimensions, the specificity of its structure, and the purpose behind its design suggest a narrative derived from more than poetic embellishment. In saving his family and the seed of all living things, Utnapishtim becomes both a survivor and a custodian, holding within his memory the final mosaic of a world erased by divine decree. After the waters recede and the chaos subsides, Utnapishtim is granted immortality. But this is not a gift in the celebratory sense. The tablets reveal it as an exile, a separation that removes him from the world he once knew. His longevity becomes a burden, anchoring him to a truth the gods wished to conceal from the new humanity. He resides at the edge of the world, beyond rivers and mountains that ordinary mortals cannot cross, as though sequestered to protect a knowledge too potent for the fragile civilizations rising from the mud. When Gilgamesh reaches him, he finds not a triumphant survivor, but a weary witness carrying the weight of secrets too heavy for a single existence. The story Utnapishtim recounts holds contradictions that challenge the image of omnipotent gods. He describes a council divided, uncertain in its judgment, regretting decisions even as they were enacted. He speaks of Enlil's fury, Enki's defiance, and the turmoil among the divine ranks as the flood unfolded with a violence greater than they had anticipated. These details present the Anunnaki not as infallible beings, but as entities bound by emotion, conflict, and limitations. Whether these traits reflect myth or memory is a question that has stirred debate for decades. But the very existence of these contradictions suggests a deeper truth. The divine world was neither stable nor unified, and the fracture that followed the flood may have been as much a rift among the gods as between gods and humans. Yet Utnapishtim is not the only keeper of ancient secrets. Sumerian temple texts describe priests tasked with preserving the tablets of destinies, inscriptions attributed directly to divine instruction. These priests often appear as shadowed figures whose names are lost to time, yet their role was pivotal. They transmitted astronomical cycles, agricultural formulas, and sacred rituals believed to contain fragments of knowledge older than the flood itself. Some tablets list measurements and calculations with no accompanying explanation, as though copied from sources the scribes themselves only partially understood. Their function was not to interpret but to preserve, carrying forward remnants of a world that had vanished. Beyond Sumer, parallel traditions reinforce the presence of such intermediaries. In Anatolia, myths speak of wandering sages bearing forbidden knowledge. In the Indus Valley, ancient hymns describe seers who emerged from isolation with cosmic insights. In the mountains north of Mesopotamia, legends tell of watchers who observed humanity from afar, documenting its transformations. Though separated by geography and language, these accounts converge in their depiction of isolated figures holding knowledge that did not belong to ordinary mortals. Scholars attribute these similarities to shared archetypes, but the consistency suggests a deeper connection, perhaps a memory of individuals who acted as conduits between eras. Archaeological findings support the existence of knowledge older than the civilizations that preserved it. Some tablets retrieved from temple archives reference instructions said to predate the flood, written in styles distinct from later compositions. Their tone is more direct, more technical, and less mythologized. Others mention old words or ancient formulas, implying that they were copying traditions already ancient in their own time. Scholars interpret this as literary convention, but the shift in style hints at a cultural memory of an earlier, more structured form of knowledge, one preserved imperfectly through the collapse. Even more enigmatic are the king lists from early dynasties, which record rulers with reigns spanning thousands of years before the flood and dramatically shorter reigns afterward. Mainstream interpretations classify these numbers as symbolic, perhaps representing eras rather than individuals. Yet the stark contrast between pre-flood and post-flood reigns suggests a significant shift remembered across generations. Whether literal or allegorical, these exaggerated lifespans reflect a cultural conviction that something fundamental changed during the transition from the old world to the new. If the Anunnaki once interacted directly with humanity, the long-lived rulers may represent intermediaries whose connection to the divine offered biological or symbolic longevity. The emotional resonance of this lost connection is most evident in the laments composed after the flood. These texts mourn not only the destruction of cities but the disappearance of beings who once guided humanity. They speak of the holy ones who no longer walk among us, of paths in the sky left empty, and of rituals performed without the voices that once taught them. These laments do not merely commemorate physical loss. They grieve the severing of a relationship that shaped the earliest civilizations. The keepers of secrets embody this rupture, standing as the last links to a world erased by both catastrophe and divine retreat. As these keepers fade from history, their silence becomes a threshold. Beyond it lies the cataclysm itself, the moment when the world that nurtured the Anunnaki's presence shattered, and the memory of their existence fragmented into myth. What happened during that upheaval will define everything that follows, revealing truths too momentous to remain buried. The silence surrounding the keepers of ancient knowledge becomes the final stillness before the world descends into its most devastating transformation. Every civilization that rose in the shadow of antiquity retains some memory of a moment when the balance of the cosmos collapsed, a time when waters surged without mercy, when the heavens groaned, and when the boundary between divine beings and mortals dissolved in terror. In Mesopotamia, this transformation crystallizes into the Great Cataclysm, the pivotal event that separates the mythic age from the fragile beginnings of recorded time. The Sumerians, Akkadians, and Babylonians preserve accounts of this upheaval with a consistency that transcends poetic embellishment. Though their tablets emphasize the flood, the underlying narrative describes something far greater: the rupture of cosmic order, the withdrawal of the Anunnaki, and the irreversible alteration of the human world. In the Atrahasis tablets, the cataclysm begins not with the wrath of a single god, but with a council divided by rising tensions. Humanity, they claim, had grown too numerous, their noise disturbing the divine hierarchy. But beneath this surface explanation lies a deeper unease, a sense that humanity had become unpredictable or perhaps too aware. The gods, once creators and caretakers, found themselves confronted with a species whose growth outpaced their control. What appears as myth carries the tone of a crisis of governance. The council gathered to debate what action to take, and the decision that emerged would mark the most consequential turning point in humanity's distant past. Creation, they resolved, would be undone. The initial stages of the cataclysm unfold like a series of calculated experiments in destruction. Plagues ravage the population. Famine spreads across the land. Drought turns the fertile earth into a desolate expanse. These events, described with unnerving specificity in the tablets, reveal a pattern of escalation rather than natural disaster. Each calamity fails to achieve the desired result, for Enki repeatedly intervenes, offering humanity the means to survive. His defiance creates friction within the divine ranks, deepening the divide between those who favored humanity's persistence and those who viewed it as a mistake. Only when the council determined that the flood, a force too vast for Enki to counter, would be unleashed, did the final stage of the cataclysm begin. The ancient texts describe the flood not as a localized inundation, but as a cosmic upheaval of unimaginable force. Storms howl without pattern. Winds tear across the land in violent spirals. Waters rise with unnatural speed, swallowing cities and fields alike. Even the gods, according to the tablets, flee in terror to higher realms, overcome by the magnitude of their own design. The flood is not an accident of nature. It is an act executed with chilling finality. The emotional turmoil among the gods as the catastrophe unfolds suggests that they did not fully anticipate the destruction they had unleashed. The flood becomes the moment when the divine realized the irreversible cost of their decision. Archaeological evidence across Mesopotamia points to multiple catastrophic floods occurring between the 4th and 3rd millennia BCE. Sediment layers reveal abrupt abandonment, crushed dwellings, and sudden breaks in cultural continuity. While mainstream interpretations attribute these disruptions to shifts in climate or river behavior, the alignment with ancient narratives remains striking. Some sites show indications of fire or seismic activity, suggesting that water was not the sole force reshaping the land. Although these findings do not prove the existence of a single global event, they confirm that ancient peoples endured periods of overwhelming destruction that could easily have inspired the memory of a great deluge. The emotional gravity of the cataclysm emerges most vividly in the laments composed after the flood. Scribes describe cities drowning in darkness, temples collapsing beneath waves, and families clinging to rooftops as the waters rose. These laments capture not only physical devastation, but spiritual anguish. The gods themselves are depicted as weeping as their creation perished, torn between remorse and fear. This duality challenges the modern perception of ancient deities as unwavering figures. Instead, it reveals them as beings capable of divided loyalties, of regret, and of recognizing the magnitude of their own actions. Utnapishtim's survival account deepens the mystery. His vessel, constructed with intricate mathematical precision, reads less like mythic metaphor and more like engineering protocol. Its 7 decks, precise proportions, and waterproofing methods appear carefully detailed. The ritual of releasing birds to test the environment mirrors practices found in later flood traditions, suggesting either a shared origin or a preservation of procedural memory. When Utnapishtim emerges onto dry land, the gods gather not in triumph but in shock. Enlil, discovering a human survivor, reacts with fury, underscoring that the flood had been intended as an absolute reset. Parallels to this story appear across cultures. In Egypt, Greece, India, Mesoamerica, and beyond, myths recount rising waters, chosen survivors, divine regret, and vessels that preserve life. Scholars attribute this to cultural diffusion or shared psychological archetypes, yet the similarities remain too precise to dismiss entirely. Whether literal or symbolic, these converging narratives suggest that something occurred, something powerful enough to fracture memory across continents and reset the trajectory of human civilization. What makes the Sumerian account uniquely compelling is what follows the cataclysm. Kingship is lowered from heaven once more, but human lifespans shorten dramatically. The gods no longer walk among mortals as they once did. Temple rituals become more ceremonial and less participatory. The world becomes quieter, more distant, as though a veil had fallen between humankind and the divine. The cataclysm becomes the fulcrum of ancient memory, the event that marks the end of an age when humans and Anunnaki coexisted and the beginning of an age defined by separation. As the waters recede in the tablets, one question rises from the ruins. What truths were lost in the transition from the old world to the new? And how did humanity attempt to reclaim them in the centuries that followed? When the waters finally receded, leaving behind a world stripped of its former shape, the silence that followed was not merely the absence of wind or voices, it was the sound of a severed connection. The bond between the divine and the mortal, once so tightly interwoven that humans walked beneath the gaze of the Anunnaki, had been fractured. The tablets describe this silence with the weight of mourning. The gods retreat, their presence withdrawn from the cities they once governed, and humanity awakens to a landscape both familiar and eerily foreign. It is from this moment that the world transitions from mythic memory into recorded history, and the rules governing human existence begin to harden into structures we still recognize today. Across the newly exposed plains, survivors emerge tentatively. They drag themselves from mountaintops, high plateaus, and fragments of structures that had withstood the deluge. The sky, once the domain of beings who descended in brilliance, now feels distant, obscured by a veil that was not physical but symbolic. Rituals once performed with direct interaction are now conducted in shadows, as the divine becomes something glimpsed rather than encountered. This shift marks the beginning of institutional religion, an attempt to reach beings who no longer walk beside humanity. In the earliest post-flood inscriptions, we find a world struggling to rebuild its identity. Cities once governed by the Anunnaki are reconstructed, but smaller, humbler, and oriented toward an altered purpose. Carved into clay are desperate attempts to preserve the last fragments of a forgotten age. Lists of kings stretching back impossibly far, descriptions of technologies no longer understood, references to devices that hummed with unseen power. The scribes do not claim ownership of this knowledge. They present it as inheritance, remnants from a time when humanity lived under different laws. This period also marks the emergence of centralized authority. Kingship, described as being lowered from heaven, no longer means divine rulers descending to guide humankind. Instead, human leaders ascend to power by claiming proximity to the divine, establishing the earliest forms of political legitimacy. Temples become the centers of administration, not only of worship. Grain storage, taxation, land distribution, and record-keeping all begin here in the vacuum left by the departure of the gods. The new leaders exert control not through divine presence, but through narrative, organizing society by invoking memories of the era that preceded the flood. technological regression becomes one of the most puzzling features of the post-flood world. The tablets hint at lost arts, metallurgy more advanced than what followed, knowledge of astronomy calibrated with astonishing precision, and architectural designs that later civilizations could not replicate. Some accounts refer to sacred tablets containing the laws and secrets of civilization, bestowed by the gods before the rupture. But these tablets are described as being fragmented, scattered, or sealed away. The sense of something lost, something immense and transformative, runs like a current beneath every inscription from this era. Yet even amid loss, humanity retains certain inheritances. They build ziggurats modeled on structures from the age of proximity. They track celestial movements with methods that seem out of place for a society supposedly rising from devastation. They encode mathematics in ways that imply continuity rather than invention. In these survivals lies the quiet truth. Not all knowledge perished in the flood. Some of it endured, carried by those who remembered, whispered across generations, reshaped into new forms that fit a diminished world. But the greatest change following the cataclysm emerges not in the earth, but in the human condition. Where once lifespans stretched across centuries, at least according to the early king lists, now they shrink dramatically. Rulers who once reigned for hundreds of years are replaced by those who reign mere decades. The very fabric of human biology seems altered, as though the departure of the Anunnaki corresponds with a withdrawal of some sustaining force. Whether literal or symbolic, the pattern is unmistakable. Humanity steps into a smaller, shorter, more fragile existence. And yet, despite the immense distance that now separates mortals from the divine, remnants of contact remain. Rituals where priests channel the voices of absent gods, dreams interpreted as messages from realms no longer accessible, strange appearances in sky and storm recorded as omens. The relationship is not gone. It has simply shifted into subtlety, ambiguity, and longing. The flood becomes the great barrier. On one side lies an era of direct interaction, long lifespans, and impossible achievements. On the other lies the world as we know it, fragmented, striving, and hungry for meaning. What rises in the generations after the cataclysm is not just civilization, it is memory. Memory encoded in symbols, rituals, architecture, and myths that refuse to fade. And it is in those memories, scattered across clay tablets and oral traditions, that the next great mystery emerges. What happened to the Anunnaki after they withdrew from the world they had shaped? The answer does not lie in a single inscription, but in the spaces between them. In the centuries that follow the Great Rupture, a curious pattern begins to take shape. Subtle at first, then unmistakable to anyone who studies the oldest tablets with unhurried attention. The presence of the Anunnaki has not vanished entirely. It has merely changed its form. What once was direct becomes distant. What once was physical becomes symbolic. And yet, through the cracks in history, certain moments gleam like fragments of a shattered mirror, reflecting something more than myth. The earliest scribes, those who wrote in the generations immediately following the flood, record strange occurrences that do not fit neatly into the new order. They speak of luminous figures glimpsed at the edges of night, of storms that moved with unnatural intelligence, of whispers carried on the wind, voices that seemed almost human, almost divine, yet belonging fully to neither. These accounts are never presented as inventions. Instead, they are described with a kind of wary reverence, as if the writers were unsure whether these encounters represented blessings or warnings. One tablet from the city of Kish describes a shining messenger descending on a column of light, delivering a series of cryptic instructions to a sleeping priest. The message speaks of rebuilding, of guarding knowledge, and of maintaining the balance between heaven and earth. The scribe notes that the messenger did not touch the ground, and that its appearance left behind a faint scent of heated stone. The description is precise, not poetic. Whoever witnessed the event believed it to be real. Another fragment found near ancient Nippur recounts a night when the stars shifted in the sky, not imperceptibly over centuries, but suddenly, in the span of a single evening. The movement frightened the shepherds who observed it, sending them running into the city. The priests interpreted the incident as a sign that the Watchers, beings associated with the Anunnaki, had repositioned themselves. To what end, the text does not say, but it emphasizes that the heavens were once the domain of these beings, and that their patterns reflect intention rather than randomness. Yet perhaps the most intriguing example comes from a series of incantations recovered from the library of Ashurbanipal. These texts refer repeatedly to the ones who withdrew beyond sight. Some scholars claim these passages describe the gods entering a symbolic realm, but the language suggests something more literal, a movement, a journey, a relocation. One line stands out for its clarity. They crossed the boundary of the upper wind, where mortal eyes cannot travel, and anchored themselves in the dark sea above. The dark sea above, a phrase that speaks not of oceans, but of the firmament. It is here that the tablets begin to intersect with astronomical knowledge. The oldest star charts from Mesopotamia display a sophistication that modern science struggles to explain. They show awareness of planetary motion long before the invention of telescopes. They map constellations with near-perfect accuracy. They predict solstices and eclipses with a degree of precision that seems impossible for a culture supposedly emerging from catastrophe. And encoded within these charts are references to objects that do not correspond to known planets or stars, moving lights, wandering bodies, temporary streaks of brilliance. The tablets never call these objects gods. Instead, they refer to them as thrones, crafts, chariots of the upper realm, or simply portents. If the Anunnaki withdrew into the sky, perhaps these markings record their lingering presence. Perhaps the beings who once strode upon the earth now traveled along paths hidden from ordinary sight. To the ancient Mesopotamians, such movements would have appeared divine, mysterious, and terrifying. But there is another possibility, one more grounded yet no less extraordinary. The Anunnaki may not have vanished. They may have retreated to a place between worlds, neither fully leaving nor fully remaining. The tablets describe a boundary, a threshold beyond which human senses fail. This concept appears repeatedly in hymns, in myths, in astronomical texts, and even in administrative records. It is always the same, a barrier of light, mist, or vibration separating the mortal realm from what lies above. What if the Anunnaki were not destroyed, nor banished, nor mythologized into irrelevance? What if they simply stepped beyond the threshold, waiting for the right moment to return? Evidence for this idea emerges not just in Mesopotamia, but in Egypt, in the Indus Valley, in pre-dynastic Anatolia, and even in the earliest oral traditions of the Arctic peoples. They all speak of beings who once walked among humans, then retreated into the sky, promising to return when the cycles of earth and heaven realign. Cycles, another recurring theme. Mesopotamian cosmology is built on them. Long cycles, measured in thousands of years. Cycles of kingship, cycles of cosmic alignment, cycles of destruction and renewal. The flood was one such turning. And according to the tablets, the withdrawal of the Anunnaki was not a final departure, but a shift in the pattern. In this era of transition, humanity becomes the steward of a world left half-finished. Tools once guided by divine hands now require mortal ingenuity. Rituals once fueled by proximity now depend on remembrance. And it is through this tension between what was lost and what might someday return that civilization begins to reshape itself. But the scribes leave us with a warning. In multiple tablets, a phrase appears almost identically, as though copied from an earlier, older source. When the watchers of the sky fall silent, listen instead to the trembling of the earth. It is a line that has puzzled researchers for generations, but in the context of the Anunnaki's withdrawal, it hints at a deeper truth. Their absence did not mark an end. It marked the beginning of a new force rising beneath the ground, a force that would shape the next era of human history and lead to a mystery as profound as the gods themselves. The centuries that followed were not peaceful transitions into a new world, but uneasy negotiations with forces humanity barely understood. Without the physical presence of the Anunnaki, the world felt unbalanced, as though a stabilizing weight had been removed from the scale of existence. The earliest cities struggled to define their identity. Authority faltered, rituals changed meaning, and through the cracks in this shifting order emerged something both familiar and deeply unsettling, a growing awareness that the earth itself had begun to stir in ways the ancients had not expected. The scribes of Uruk, careful and methodical, recorded an unusual pattern of tremors that shook the region with increasing frequency. These were not ordinary earthquakes. They came in bursts, preceded by low vibrations described as the humming beneath the clay. The tremors were followed by strange phenomena on the surface, pools of water heating without fire, dust rising in spirals despite windless skies, and patches of ground that glowed faintly at night. Some interpreted these events as natural. Others believed they were signs left behind by entities older than the Anunnaki, beings connected not to the heavens, but to the deep places of the earth. One temple hymn speaks of the sleepers below, figures cloaked in shadow stirring when the world grows quiet. The hymn warns against digging too deeply, as the soil holds memory, and sometimes resentment. This idea appears again in tablets recovered from Lagash, where a priest described a vision in which a fissure opened in the ground, revealing an immense chamber filled with pale light. Inside stood towering figures carved from stone, motionless but arranged with such precision that they seemed ready to wake at any moment. The priest insisted these were guardians left behind by the Anunnaki to watch over humanity in their absence. Others feared they were older powers, long suppressed and now free to rise. Across Mesopotamia, fear grew that the retreat of the Anunnaki had created a vacuum, and something from the deep earth was eager to fill it. Farmers reported hearing distant rumbling at night, like drums muffled beneath layers of stone. Shepherds claimed to see silhouettes moving across the dunes, shapes too large to be human, yet too fluid to be statues. A few accounts mention glowing eyes watching from the edges of fields, vanishing when approached. These reports were dismissed publicly, but privately, they were collected and studied by the priesthoods. The consistency was troubling. It was during this same era that the cities began to adopt new forms of fortification, structures oriented not outward toward enemy armies, but downward toward the depths. Archaeologists have long puzzled over certain underground chambers beneath ancient ziggurats, spaces that seem defensive rather than ceremonial. Many of these rooms contain carvings of serpentine figures, spirals descending into darkness, or symbols associated with containment rather than worship. Curiously, the inscriptions often mention binding the breath of the earth, as if the ground itself posed a threat. One of the most enigmatic artifacts from this period is a stone tablet recovered near the ruins of Eridu. It depicts two worlds, one above, filled with stars and winged figures, the other below, crowded with elongated shadows. Between them is a narrow band labeled the Trembling Gate. Scholars debate the meaning of the term, but many agree it represents a threshold between realms, an unstable border that grew weaker after the departure of the Anunnaki. If true, the Trembling Gate may symbolize the rising influence of forces that had long been held silent. This raises a troubling possibility. If the Anunnaki maintained equilibrium between the heavens and the earth, their withdrawal could have created an imbalance, allowing suppressed energies to slip upward. The oldest myths describe this moment as a thinning of the world's skin, when what was hidden could be seen and what was forgotten could return. The Sumerians believed that the earth held secrets as ancient as the sky, secrets the gods themselves once feared. Another clue comes from the increased use of protective rituals during this era. Simple offerings were replaced by complex rites requiring specific metals, chants, and geometric arrangements. Many of these rituals were performed not at the tops of temples but deep within their foundations. Some demanded absolute silence. Others required fire to be extinguished entirely. The priests insisted these practices were meant to stabilize the city, but the instructions emphasize protection from the rising breath below, a phrase scholars struggle to interpret. Even more baffling is a recurring motif that appears in carvings across multiple cities. A serpentine form coiling upward from the ground, facing a descending figure with wings. Between them is a crack in the earth marked by symbols of conflict or negotiation. It is as if the Sumerians sought to depict a meeting between two forces, one descending from the heavens, the other climbing from the depths, each contending for influence over the world of humans. If the Anunnaki truly withdrew beyond the sky, and if something older stirred beneath the surface, then Mesopotamia found itself caught between two immense pressures, each shaping the destiny of human civilization in ways the ancient scribes could not fully describe. What survived in their writings is not a complete story, but a warning, one that becomes clearer as we follow the path they left behind. For in the next stage of this mystery, the trembling gate does not stay closed. It widens, and the forces rising from below begin to leave marks upon the world that can still be seen today, in ruins buried by time and in legends whispered across continents. The widening of the trembling gate was not recorded as a single event, but as a gradual encroachment, a slow intensification of anomalies that seeped into the rhythm of ancient life. What began as faint vibrations beneath the soil soon became a persistent thrum felt in the soles of bare feet. Children reported hearing tones that adults could not detect, a distant ringing that rose and fell like a hidden chant. Animals grew restless at night, circling enclosures without stopping, as if sensing something approaching from below. Though priests tried to calm the populace with familiar ceremonies, a quiet fear settled over the cities, a fear that something ancient had begun to awaken. Archaeological layers from this era show a shift in construction practices. Houses grew thicker foundations, not to support upper floors, but to create a barrier between the inhabitants and the earth itself. In Nippur, entire neighborhoods elevated their streets by packing layers of clay beneath them, raising the ground as though distance alone could offer protection. The ziggurats grew taller, reaching skyward with greater urgency, while their lower chambers became increasingly fortified. These chambers were lined with bitumen, copper plates, and, most mysteriously, patterns of intersecting lines carved into stone. Some scholars believe these patterns were early attempts at energy redirection, designed to stabilize vibrations coming from beneath. Across the desert plains, shepherds continued to describe sightings of distant shapes, large forms drifting across dunes under moonlight, their silhouettes blurring into the night air. What unsettled many was that these shapes left no footprints, as though they were not wholly present in the physical world. In one account, a shepherd claimed that a massive figure approached his flock, causing the animals to scatter in terror. But when he raised his torch, the figure dissolved like smoke, leaving behind only the rhythmic hum that had begun to plague the region. Priests traveling between cities carried with them tablets filled with urgent warnings. Some inscriptions speak of the rising beneath the clay, others mention the forgotten hunger, or the watchers of the deep. These phrases appear repeatedly, carved in trembling strokes that suggest the scribes themselves were afraid. One tablet recovered near Bad Tabira lists a series of protective rites for sealing the gate below. The instructions reference a material called black copper, a metal whose exact composition has been lost to time. It is described as resonating at a frequency that pacified the earth, though no explanation survives for how the Sumerians discovered this property. The fear of the deep became so ingrained in society that new myths emerged, myths that diverged sharply from earlier stories centered on the Anunnaki. Instead of heavenly descent, these tales described emergence from below, great serpents coiled around pillars of stone, giants with molten eyes climbing from fissures, and shadowed beings who whispered promises to those who listened at night. These myths were not celebratory. They carried tones of caution, warning the young to avoid caves, abandoned wells, and cracks in the earth where darkness seemed too deep. Some of the most compelling evidence of this changing worldview comes from an artifact unearthed near the ancient city of Kish. It depicts a figure kneeling beside a crack in the ground. Beneath the crack is a swirling mass of lines representing movement. Above the crack stands a winged figure, arms outstretched as if restraining the rising force. Scholars debate whether the winged figure represents an Anunnaki or a priest performing a ritual. Either way, the message is unmistakable. The ground had become a battlefield. It was in this climate of growing anxiety that the phenomenon known as the night trembling was first recorded. According to ancient hymns, entire cities would wake at once to vibrations so intense they caused water to ripple in bowls and dust to fall from ceilings. No damage accompanied these tremors, but the psychological toll was immense. The people interpreted them as warnings, signs that the boundary between worlds was weakening. Some believed the Anunnaki would return to restore balance. Others feared that the withdrawal of the gods had permanently altered the world, leaving humanity exposed to forces beyond comprehension. The priests, sensing a loss of control, developed new rites that merged old traditions with emerging fears. One such ritual involved placing jars filled with water beneath temple floors. The water served as an early detection system. If ripples formed spontaneously, the priests knew the trembling gate had stirred. Another ritual required the placement of copper rods around the city perimeter, hammered deep into the earth. These rods were believed to anchor the land, preventing the rise of forces dwelling beneath the surface. Despite these efforts, odd phenomena intensified. Unexplained lights flickered beneath thin layers of soil. Patches of ground warmed under bare feet. In some villages, the earth emitted faint pulses of blue or green light during the darkest nights. Travelers described hearing whispers rising from cracks in the ground, words they could not understand, spoken in a cadence too rhythmic to be natural. Some fled these regions altogether, seeking refuge in areas where the trembling was weaker. Yet amid rising fear, a strange curiosity also took hold. Young apprentices in temple schools began studying the tremors as if they were messages rather than warnings. They mapped the vibrations, noting their patterns. Some concluded that the trembling was not chaotic, but followed an order, an underlying rhythm that hinted at intelligence. These apprentices developed primitive seismographs using clay bowls, copper needles, and suspended stones, decades before such devices became known elsewhere. Their discoveries were unsettling. The tremors were becoming more frequent and more coordinated, as though something below was probing the world above. The tension between fear and curiosity mirrored a larger struggle. Humans caught between the absence of the Anunnaki and the approach of something ancient, powerful, and unknown. Each tremor, each whispered sound, each flicker of light was a reminder that the world beneath their feet was not inert. It was alive, aware, and perhaps preparing for an emergence the ancient cities were not ready to face. And then, without warning, the trembling changed. What had been rhythmic became forceful. What had been distant became immediate. The earth shifted in ways that defied explanation, as though responding to a call or releasing something long restrained. The next chapter in this mystery begins not with a tremor but with an opening, one that the Sumerians documented in frantic strokes, trying to capture the moment the gate below finally stirred wide enough to reveal what waited in the depths. When the trembling gate finally widened enough to reveal itself, the ancient world recorded the moment not as a simple geological event, but as a rupture that seemed to disrupt the very boundary between the seen and the unseen. The earliest inscriptions describing this phenomenon come from a set of tablets unearthed near the ruins of a dab. They depict a night in which the earth breathed out, releasing a gust of wind warm enough to singe hair and dry riverbanks. That breath was followed by a deep groan, a long, resonant sound felt more in the bones than heard by the ears. The scribes wrote that people fell to their knees, clutching their chests, convinced the ground had spoken their names. After this initial rupture, the soil across several regions split in jagged lines. These were not ordinary fissures. They glowed faintly, pulsing like embers buried beneath ash. Witnesses described colors they struggled to name, shades between fire and lightning, illuminating the cracks with an eerie vibrancy. The priests rushed to interpret the event, but their records show only uncertainty. Some believed the glow was a sign that the Anunnaki were returning. Others feared it was the opposite. Their departure had weakened the fabric of the world, exposing humanity to forces the gods once kept contained. One inscription from Lagash describes what happened shortly after the cracks appeared. A low mist rose from the fissures, moving with unsettling intelligence. It drifted toward the outskirts of the city, avoiding canals and buildings as if searching for something specific. Witnesses claimed the mist hummed at certain frequencies, causing clay jars to vibrate and wooden beams to creak. People hid in their homes, listening to the sounds of objects rattling without wind. When the sun rose, the mist dissipated, but the cracks remained, and the ground continued to pulse with a life that did not belong to it. Stranger still were the figures reported near these fissures. Shepherds and travelers described silhouettes emerging from the shimmering cracks. Tall, indistinct forms that seemed more shadow than substance. Their movements were fluid, bending in ways no human body could. Some figures appeared briefly before vanishing into the mist. Others lingered, observing the world with a stillness that suggested thought rather than instinct. One tablet recounts a terrifying encounter. A group of travelers saw a humanoid shape rise halfway out of a fissure, its arms long and tapering, its head elongated like a flame. When they approached, the figure dissolved into streaks of light and sank back into the earth. These accounts may sound fantastical, but they appear consistently across different regions, suggesting that the event was widespread. Even modern analysis of the tablet chronology reveals a sharp spike in references to the deep ones, the watchers below, and the luminous shadows. The consistency implies a phenomenon too large to be dismissed as invention. Something had emerged from the depths, even if only partially, something the Sumerians could only interpret through the limited language and understanding of their time. As the fissures multiplied, so did the effects on daily life. Wells turned strangely warm. Clay bricks developed hairline cracks, as if reacting to internal vibrations. Livestock refused to graze near certain fields, choosing instead to cluster close to city walls. Some regions reported an unseasonal blooming of plants, their petals tinged with unusual colors. In others, crops withered overnight, their leaves curled and brittle. Priests documented these anomalies with increasing alarm, unsure whether the changes were signs of renewal or decay. During this period, ancient astronomers also reported unusual patterns in the sky. Stars flickered erratically, as though obscured by an unseen filter. In some nights, constellations appeared displaced, as if the heavens themselves had shifted. A rare alignment of planets was noted around the same time as the fissures opened, a configuration associated with omens in Sumerian cosmology. The priests debated whether the alignment had triggered the rupture, or whether both were symptoms of a deeper imbalance. Either way, the timing was too precise to ignore. One of the most compelling artifacts from this era is a bronze disc recovered near Nippur. It depicts two layers of existence, the world of humans above and the domain of shadows below. Between them is a jagged line, clearly the trembling gate. Above the line, winged figures gesture downward. Below it, serpentine shapes coil around geometric structures. The disk suggests an interaction, a meeting point where heavenly and subterranean forces were beginning to converge. Some scholars believe the disk was used in rituals meant to stabilize the rupture, while others think it was simply a visual record of the cosmic configuration that made the event possible. As the earth continued to pulse with unnatural energy, the priests convened in secret gatherings to discuss their findings. Fragments of these meetings survive in temple archives. They speak of a resonance imbalance, a phrase startlingly modern in its implication. The priests believed that the withdrawal of the Anunnaki had altered the energetic equilibrium between the heavens, the earth, and the realms below. Without divine anchors, the world's frequencies had begun to drift, allowing forces from the deep earth to rise unimpeded. But not all priests agreed. A faction within the priesthood, known only as the Keepers of the Lower Gate, argued that the fissures were not breaches, but invitations. They believed that the shadows rising from below were ancient allies predating even the Anunnaki. According to their tradition, the subterranean realm had once been home to beings who shaped the early earth, entities who guided the flow of minerals, geothermal currents, and subterranean water. These beings, the keepers claimed, were misunderstood by later generations and unfairly demonized. The fissures, they argued, were pathways through which these primordial forces had come to communicate, warning humanity of an impending shift. Regardless of interpretation, the danger grew. The trembling intensified. Fissures widened. Strange lights flickered more frequently. The line between curiosity and terror blurred. Cities that once stood confidently on solid ground now trembled under the weight of uncertainty. And amid this escalating turmoil, a question whispered through ancient streets. If the Anunnaki had left because they foresaw this event, were they retreating or fleeing? Did they depart to allow humanity to mature, or did they abandon a world doomed to fracture? As the ancient cities braced for what might emerge next, the gate widened once more, not with light this time, but with sound. A deep tone reverberated through the land, vibrating through stone, clay, and bone. It was a call, or a warning, heard across the region. What followed that sound would change the course of ancient history and leave marks still visible in ruins buried beneath shifting sands. The sound that erupted from the trembling gate was unlike anything the ancient world had ever recorded. It was deep, resonant, and layered, as if multiple tones were woven into a single continuous wave. Those who experienced it described it as a vibration more than a noise, something that resonated inside their ribs, tightened their lungs, and made their vision blur for several seconds. Pottery shattered. Reeds along the riverbanks bent as though pushed by invisible wind. Birds erupted from marshes in frantic spirals, and livestock collapsed to their knees, trembling uncontrollably. The tone rolled across the plains like a great breath released from the interior of the earth. In the aftermath, silence did not return immediately. A faint humming lingered beneath the soil, rising and fading in irregular intervals, like the heartbeat of some immense organism awakening after a long slumber. People became fearful of standing barefoot on the ground, convinced the earth might speak to them again. Even the priests, typically the pillars of composure, began to show signs of anxiety. Their rituals intensified. Fires burned at all hours atop temple platforms. Children were kept indoors. Marketplaces grew quiet as the air filled with expectation, as though something momentous was drawing near. Within days of the tone's emergence, new phenomena appeared across the region. The first was the sudden rise of mist-like forms around the fissures. Unlike ordinary fog, these vapors moved with coherence, forming swirling shapes that glided above the cracks. Some witnesses claimed they resembled elongated figures. Others insisted they were nothing more than light, refracting through heated air. But one detail repeated across many accounts. The mist glowed faintly, emitting colors that shifted in slow gradients, deep blues, strange greens, shimmering golds, unlike anything produced by fire or moonlight. Another unsettling development came from the wells. Water levels rose inexplicably, filling containers left nearby. Yet the water itself behaved strangely. It retained warmth even at night and rippled without any sign of movement in the air. At times, the water seemed to pulse in harmony with the hum beneath the ground. Priests interpreted this as an omen that the realms below were exerting influence on the surface world. Farmers refused to drink from these wells, believing the water carried the breath of spirits long sealed beneath the earth. Perhaps the most disturbing phenomenon involved the shadows themselves. People began reporting that their shadows shifted independently of their bodies, elongating or bending at angles out of sync with the light. Some shadows quivered slightly as though responding to the hum. Others appeared to split briefly into two forms before merging again. A few witnesses believed they saw shapes passing between shadows, figures gliding along the edges of darkness, using the absence of light as a veil to move across the world unnoticed. These reports terrified the populace, for they suggested that whatever was rising from the depths did not obey the rules of the physical world. Despite mounting fear, a small group within the priesthood saw these anomalies as signs of revelation rather than doom. The keepers of the lower gate, who had long believed the subterranean forces were ancient allies, interpreted the tone as a call to communion. They argued that the shadows and forms emerging from the cracks were manifestations of entities who wished to re-establish a connection long forgotten. To them, the trembling gate was not a wound in the earth, but an invitation, an opening through which wisdom older than the Anunnaki might pass. To test their beliefs, the keepers conducted a clandestine ritual at one of the largest fissures. Using copper rods, black copper fragments, and a series of geometric patterns traced into the soil, they sought to stabilize the resonance and communicate with whatever dwelled below. The ritual lasted through the night. At dawn, the witnesses reported that the mist around the fissure condensed into a distinct shape, a towering figure composed of layered, shimmering light. The priests fell to their knees, overwhelmed by the sight. The figure bent toward them as though observing their presence, then dissolved into glowing threads that sank back into the earth. The fissure pulsed once, sealing itself partially. While the keepers interpreted this as a moment of successful contact, others saw it as a dangerous escalation. News of the ritual spread quickly, stirring both curiosity and terror. Some believed the priests had awakened something beyond their control. Others insisted the priests had prevented a greater disaster by appeasing the entities below. The result was a deepening divide within the priesthood itself. One faction insisted the old traditions must be upheld to call the Anunnaki back. The other believed humanity must embrace the rising forces and learn to coexist with them. This conflict manifested throughout the cities. Temples that once united communities became battlegrounds of ideology. Ceremonies overlapped. Priests argued openly. Some groups attempted to close the fissures using heavy stones and bitumen. Others expanded them deliberately, hoping to strengthen communication with the forces below. The public grew increasingly anxious, feeling caught between two invisible giants, those who had left and those who now stirred beneath. Amid the chaos, subtle yet significant changes began to appear in the behavior of the people themselves. Some individuals reported vivid dreams filled with geometric patterns and pulsating light. Others felt urged to draw symbols they had never seen, their hands moving with uncanny precision. A few began speaking in unfamiliar cadences during sleep, uttering sounds that echoed the tone of the trembling gate. The priesthood debated whether these individuals were blessed or cursed, conduits or victims. In either case, the boundary between humanity and the rising forces had begun to blur. The climax of this strange period came when the largest fissure, near the outskirts of Uruk, widened dramatically. The ground split with a crack that echoed across the plains. Light erupted from the opening, brighter than any fire, yet soft enough to stare at directly. Those who approached reported feeling a powerful vibration inside their skulls, as though thoughts not their own were pressing gently against their minds. One scribe fainted, and later claimed he had seen visions of a vast underworld filled with cities of crystalline stone, populated by beings whose forms shifted like liquid light. But before more could be learned, the fissure sealed itself with sudden force. The ground slammed shut, sending shock waves through nearby fields. The light vanished. The hum ceased. For the first time in months, the soil fell silent. This sudden closure left the people both relieved and deeply unsettled. Something had attempted to rise from the depths and had either been forced back or had chosen to withdraw. In the silence that followed, rumors spread rapidly. Some said the Anunnaki had intervened, slamming the gate shut. Others believed the forces below had retreated of their own accord, waiting for a more opportune moment. But the most troubling possibility lingered like a shadow across the land. The fissure had not closed permanently. It had only paused, biding its time, adjusting its resonance for a future moment when the world would once again tremble under the weight of something ancient stirring below. What happened next would reveal whether the ruptures were warnings, promises, or preludes to a greater transformation, one that future generations would struggle to decipher as myth, history, or something far more profound. The sudden sealing of the great fissure near Uruk did not mark an end to the ancient upheaval. It marked a shift. The silence that followed was too complete, too deliberate, as if the earth itself were holding its breath. People ventured outdoors cautiously, listening for the hum that had haunted them for months. But the ground was quiet. Animals grazed without fear. The sky returned to its normal patterns. For a brief moment, life seemed to settle into an uneasy calm. Yet beneath this calm lay an unspoken truth. The forces that had stirred below had not vanished. They had changed their rhythm. In the days that followed, the priesthood convened to interpret the meaning of the closure. The keepers of the lower gate insisted the sealing was a sign of successful communication, evidence that the entities below acknowledged humanity's presence and chose to withdraw peacefully. But the traditionalists, those who still longed for the return of the Anunnaki, believed the opposite. To them, the fissure's closure was an act of suppression, a sign that the gods who had once ruled from the heavens were still exerting influence, stifling the rise of an ancient rival. The debate grew so heated that it split entire temple communities. In Nippur, two sects formed under the same roof. One prepared offerings to the sky, lighting lamps atop ziggurats and reciting hymns that honored the paths of celestial beings. The other gathered in the lower chambers, chanting rhythmic verses meant to resonate with the deep earth. The city became a symbol of the dual forces shaping the ancient world, one pulling upward toward forgotten heavens, the other drawing downward toward awakening depths. For ordinary people, the conflict was not philosophical, it was practical. Farmers noticed changes in the soil. In some regions, crops flourished as never before, growing taller and richer. In others, fields that had been fertile for generations turned barren, their soil hardened and unresponsive. Wells once warmed by subterranean tremors cooled to their normal temperatures. The strange pulses that had caused water to ripple without wind now appeared only sporadically. Yet the memory of those pulses lingered, and every ripple in a bowl or vibration beneath a footstep sparked fear. The strangest change came to those who had been touched by the resonance during the height of the tremors. These individuals, scribes, shepherds, temple apprentices, began to experience moments of heightened perception. They sensed subtle shifts in temperature, felt tremors others could not detect, and dreamed of shapes and sounds they could not describe in ordinary words. Many of them avoided sleep, fearful of visions that felt too vivid to be dreams. A few were brought before the priests, who examined them with both fascination and dread. The traditionalists saw these individuals as tainted by forces from below. The keepers saw them as chosen, conduits between realms, capable of bridging the divide the Anunnaki had left behind. One of the most remarkable accounts from this era comes from a clay tablet discovered near Shuropak. It tells the story of a young scribe named Etel Enu, who began drawing intricate patterns during moments of trance. These patterns, when examined centuries later, resembled geometric principles not formally documented until much later in human history. Some shapes matched waveforms. Others looked like maps of vibrations or energy fields. Etel Enu claimed the patterns came from voices in the dark beneath the clay, though he insisted the voices were neither frightening nor hostile. The priests confiscated his drawings, but a few fragments survived, etched into the margins of practice tablets he hid from view. Another account, from the city of Umma, describes a woman who began speaking in a rhythmic cadence during sleep, uttering sounds that mimicked the deep tone heard during the great fissure's opening. These sounds caused nearby vessels to vibrate, leading some priests to hypothesize that she was channeling the resonance of the lower realm. The keepers of the lower gate revered her, treating her words as prophecy. The traditionalists saw her as a danger, proof that humanity had allowed forbidden forces to seep into their world. She became a symbol of a growing fear, that the trembling gate had opened not only the earth, but the minds of those sensitive to its call. Even with the fissure sealed, signs of the subterranean presence persisted. Strange lights occasionally flickered at night, appearing as brief glimmers along cracks in the ground. Small sections of soil glowed faintly when stepped upon, as though storing the remnants of the resonance. Animals sometimes gathered unexpectedly around these spots, sitting silently for long periods before dispersing. These behaviors confused farmers but fascinated the keepers, who saw them as evidence that the earth itself communicated through subtle signs. Amid these subtle phenomena, a new kind of tablet began circulating among the priesthood, tablets that attempted to explain the nature of the deep realm. These writings were speculative, filled with metaphors and riddles. They described a world beneath the world, illuminated not by fire or sun, but by its own internal radiance. This realm, according to the texts, housed beings of light and shadow, entities capable of shifting form, communicating through vibration, and manipulating matter through resonance rather than touch. Some priests believed these beings were predecessors to the Anunnaki. Others thought they were an entirely separate lineage, one that had shaped the early Earth long before the gods descended from the stars. The most controversial claim among the tablets was that the deep realm was not merely a place, but a frequency, a state of existence overlapping with the human world, but normally inaccessible. The fissures, therefore, were not breaches, but alignments, moments when the world's resonance shifted enough to reveal what lay beside or beneath it. If true, this implied that the Anunnaki themselves may have used such alignments to enter and exit the earthly realm. Their departure after the flood might have triggered an oscillation that exposed the lower frequency rather than sealed it. This idea terrified the traditionalists. If the Anunnaki's departure had destabilized the world, then their return might be impossible without worsening the imbalance. And if the forces below were rising to reclaim what they believed was theirs, humanity might soon find itself caught between cosmic tides, one descending from ancient heavens, the other rising from primordial depths. As these debates consumed the priesthood, the ground remained quiet, too quiet. The silence felt heavy, charged with a tension that no one could name. It was in this silence that the people of the ancient world began to prepare, consciously or not, for a moment of convergence, a moment when the heavens and the underworld would no longer remain separate. For the trembling gate had not closed forever. It had only entered a new phase, gathering strength for a revelation that would challenge the very foundation of human understanding. And when the next sign appeared, it would not come from the ground, but from the sky. suggesting that the story of the Anunnaki and the fate they carried into the heavens was far from finished. The quiet that settled over ancient Mesopotamia in the wake of the fissure's sealing was deceptive, so subtle that only the most attuned among the people sensed the shift taking shape above them. For while the trembling of the earth faded into memory, a new pattern began to form in the sky, emerging not as sudden terror, but as slow, deliberate change. It started with a star, one so faint it had gone unnoticed for generations, growing brighter night after night until shepherds began marking its position on tablets of wax and clay. They believed it was a sign, though of what, none could agree. The first reports came from nomadic tribes wandering the plains beyond Lagash. They spoke of a wandering torch that moved against the sky's familiar order, drifting along a path unknown to astrologers. The priests of Uruk were skeptical, dismissing the nomads' accounts as distortions caused by sandstorms. Yet as weeks passed, the object became visible across the region, gaining a brilliance that rivaled the brightest known stars. Sumerian astronomers, accustomed to cycles that remained constant for centuries, were shaken. The heavens had always been predictable, stable, ordered, and bound by divine law. But the movement of this object violated the celestial map laid down by the Anunnaki themselves. The priests consulted the Emul-Apin star catalogs, searching desperately for a precedent. They found none. The object had no name, no classification, no mythic association. It occupied a space that should have been empty. And more troubling, its trajectory was irregular, as if guided not by celestial mechanics, but by intention. That thought alone caused unrest among the astronomers, for only one type of being, according to ancient doctrine, had ever moved freely across the heavens, the Anunnaki. As the wandering star brightened, strange phenomena began to accompany its rise. Birds altered their migration patterns. Livestock grew restless at night. The air acquired a subtle charge that lifted the fine hairs on the arms of those who stood beneath the open sky. Mystics claimed to hear whispers carried on the evening winds, faint, harmonic tones that echoed the deep resonance once felt beneath the earth. To the keepers of the lower gate, this was clear evidence that the realms above and below were beginning to align. To the traditionalists, it was a sign of returning divine judgment. One night, near the city of Ur, witnesses reported seeing a vertical column of light descend from the sky, illuminating a patch of desert sand. The light was described as neither fire nor lightning, but something in between, brilliant yet cold, focused yet shifting, as though woven from threads of pure radiance. The column lasted only a few breaths, then vanished without sound. In its place, the sand had fused into smooth, glass-like shapes, arranged in patterns that defied explanation. When priests examined the site, they found faint geometric impressions seared into the surface, reminiscent of the patterns carved centuries earlier by Etel Enu during his trance drawings. These phenomena sparked a flood of speculation. Some claimed the Anunnaki were returning at last, following a path charted long before the flood. Others insisted the lights were messages, warnings, or invitations from a realm humanity had forgotten. A few whispered a darker thought, that these were not the Anunnaki at all, but the beings from beneath the earth, rising into the sky through harmonics unknown to mortals. If the deep realm had learned to project itself upward, then the wandering star might not represent arrival but intrusion. Across the temples, debates turned to arguments, and arguments to schisms. The High Council of Eridu fractured into three factions: those who awaited the Anunnaki's return, those who feared an emergent power from below, and those who believed the heavens themselves were destabilizing due to ancient cosmic events, long predicted but little understood. They pored over ancient prophecies, some nearly erased by time, searching for patterns. One fragment in particular captured their attention, a passage describing the star that returns from the road of silence, an object that appears when the watchers of the deep rise to meet the lords of the sky. This passage rattled even the oldest priests. If true, it implied that the realms above and below were not separate but cyclical, two halves of a cosmic system that periodically collided. And if collision was imminent, then humanity stood at the center of a convergence that had shaped epochs and erased civilizations. As fear spread, so did fascination. Ordinary citizens gathered at night to watch the bright wandering star, completely unaware of the cosmic implications debated in the temples. They saw only a beautiful, mysterious light, and many interpreted it as a blessing. Children gave it names. Poets composed hymns in its honor. For the common people, the star symbolized hope, perhaps even a return to the age when gods walked among mortals. Only the learned understood that such a return, if real, would not come without cost. The first clear sign that the wandering star was more than a celestial anomaly came when its brightness intensified suddenly during a new moon. The surrounding constellations dimmed as though washed in its glow. Then, for the first time, it exhibited a pulse, an intermittent flicker, methodical and rhythmic, like a heartbeat. Astronomers recorded the pulses meticulously, discovering that the intervals matched the resonance frequencies recorded during the early tremors of the deep fissure. This connection horrified the priests. The heavens and the earth were echoing each other, vibrating in harmony. The convergence had begun. Then, on a night remembered for centuries, the wandering star altered its course. Instead of drifting across the sky, it paused, halting its movement entirely, defying every law known to the ancients. It stood still above the horizon, unmoving, unblinking, as though watching the world below. And when it did, something stirred beneath the ground. A tremor, subtle but unmistakable, rippled across the land. Pottery rattled. Animals bristled. A low tone, faint but deep, resonated through the soil, matching the pulses of the star above. The people of Sumer froze in place, ancient instinct telling them this alignment was not random, but deliberate, an echo of forces long separated now reconnecting across realms. The priests, shaking with fear and awe, understood before anyone else. Whatever had departed the earth in ages past, whatever had withdrawn to the heavens after the flood, whatever had whispered through the tremors and the resonance, was returning, not as a memory, not as a myth, but as a presence. The wandering star was no star at all, and its arrival would reveal what the Sumerian tablets never dared to record. The night the wandering star froze in the heavens marked a turning point, not only for the priests who interpreted omens, but for every living soul across Sumer. What had once been dismissed as a passing anomaly now loomed as a silent presence, a watcher suspended above the horizon, neither advancing nor fading, as if studying the world it had returned to. This stillness unsettled even those who did not believe in celestial portents. Farmers paused in the fields at dusk, sensing a shift in the air. Shepherds found their flocks huddled together, trembling without apparent cause. And in the great ziggurats of Ur, Nippur, and Uruk, the flames of temple braziers flickered unnaturally, bending toward the direction of the unmoving light. At first, the high councils across the cities tried to maintain composure. They reassured the public that celestial pauses were rare, but not unheard of. Yet behind closed doors, the astronomer priests admitted they had no precedent for this. No star had ever behaved with such intentional stillness. The calculations etched into clay tablets were useless. The laws they relied upon for centuries seemed suddenly irrelevant. The star did not drift, wobble, or fade. It simply held its position, as though anchored by an unseen force. And as the days passed, it grew brighter still, casting a pale glow that remained visible even during daylight. The first clear sign that the phenomenon's influence extended beyond visual spectacle came from the animal world. Birds began abandoning their migratory routes, spiraling instead around invisible points in the sky. Fish near the shores of the Euphrates surfaced simultaneously, their bodies shimmering in the strange luminosity. Dogs refused to leave the threshold of their homes at night, growling at the sky with their hackles raised. Even the insects behaved oddly, clustering in patterns that mirrored constellations the priests recognized. Nature, it seemed, was responding to a signal imperceptible to human senses. Human behavior shifted as well. Sleep grew troubled across the land. People woke with vivid dreams, many recounting similar visions, towering figures, radiant yet indistinct, standing on platforms of light. Others described humming structures, like great harps vibrating at impossible scales. A few dreamers insisted they saw deep caverns illuminated by the same pale glow as the wandering star, as though the influence of the object was reaching down into the earth. The consistency of these accounts disturbed the keepers of omens, who realized that whatever intelligence guided the star might have been using dreams as its first point of contact. Amid this growing unease, the oldest priests demanded a return to texts seldom read aloud. Those salvaged from the earliest days after the flood, carved before the gods withdrew entirely. These tablets were locked in sealed chambers within the ziggurats, protected from uninitiated eyes by layers of ritual. Only a handful of elders were permitted to access them. As they dusted off the brittle tablets and traced their fingers over ancient symbols, they found references to skylights that had appeared in a forgotten age. Not stars, but the watchers of the high winds, described as beings or vessels that hovered silently before great transitions. No instructions were given on how to greet or avoid them, only the ominous warning, "When the light halts, the sky shall open." This phrase triggered immediate alarm. The priests argued about its meaning, unsure whether the opening sky signified divine descent, cosmic disaster, or something entirely unknown. The more pragmatic among them attempted to interpret the wandering star in scientific terms, suggesting it might be an undiscovered comet or a celestial anomaly. But their confidence wavered each time they observed its behavior. Too controlled, too deliberate, too synchronized with earthly phenomena to be a natural body. Then came the night of the resonance. As twilight deepened, a low-frequency vibration rolled through the land, faint but pervasive. People felt it in their bones before hearing it. Windows rattled. Water in clay bowls quivered. In the temples, the copper strings of ceremonial lyres began humming on their own, perfectly matching the pulse of the light overhead. Priests leapt back in terror as instruments played themselves, vibrating under an external influence. Those who lived near the old fissure, the sealed cleft that had once pulsed with forbidden harmonics, fled in panic as the ground trembled gently, resonating with a familiar, long-suppressed frequency. Though the fissure did not reopen, it responded unmistakably to the wandering star, as if acknowledging a call from an ancient companion. The people of the lower villages recognized the sensation immediately. The deep tone that had once rattled their teeth returned with uncanny precision. This was no coincidence. It was communication. When the priests realized this, they convened emergency councils, debating whether the star was signaling to something beneath the earth or activating a system that had lain dormant for generations. Some hypothesized a cosmic alignment that bridged the realm of the Anunnaki with unknown forces below. Others speculated that the star itself was a craft, an ancient vessel returning to survey the world it had once influenced. But even the boldest theories failed to explain the exact synchronization of sky and soil. The final piece of evidence arrived unexpectedly. During the peak of the resonance, the wandering star emitted a single, sharp pulse, so bright it cast shadows even at midnight. For an instant, the light expanded into a perfect sphere, revealing a structured interior, a lattice of geometric forms arranged with such precision that several astronomers fainted upon witnessing it. The geometry was unmistakably artificial. Though visible for just a heartbeat, it was enough to shatter all doubt. The object in the sky was not a star, not a comet, not a celestial anomaly. It was engineered. The pulse triggered a cascade of effects on the ground. The fused glass patterns near previously still, began vibrating in rhythmic sequences. In Eridu, an ancient stone stele cracked open to reveal carvings hidden beneath its weathered exterior. Carvings that matched the geometry glimpsed within the luminous sphere. And in Nippur, the oldest tablets stored in secret chambers emitted faint warmth, as if awakened by the pulse. The implications were staggering. The star was activating artifacts left on Earth long before the flood. Suddenly, the idea that the Anunnaki were returning seemed too small. This was something older, more complex, more deeply tied to the hidden architecture of the world. The priests realized with horror that they were not witnessing an approach. They were witnessing a reactivation. As dawn broke, the wandering star dimmed slightly but held its position. Its message had been sent. Something had awakened beneath the earth. Something had stirred within the relics of forgotten ages, and the sky, once sealed, was beginning to open. The dawn, following the great pulse, rose slowly, as though hesitating to spread light across a world that had changed overnight. When the sun finally climbed above the horizon, its rays met an atmosphere subtly altered, colors more muted, shadows stretched longer than expected, and a faint haze lingering near the ground, like breath trapped between realms. The wandering star remained fixed in its unnatural stillness, dimmed yet purposeful, as though observing the planet it had awakened. Across every city from to Sippar, people stepped outside in silence, sensing an invisible tension wrapped around the land, something neither divine nor earthly, but undeniably present. In the ziggurats, the priesthood had not slept. They gathered in upper courtyards, their faces drawn and pale from the night's revelations. Some clutched ritual objects for comfort, others stared into the brightening sky, waiting for a second pulse. None came. Instead, the star held steady, its calm almost more unnerving than the explosive burst that preceded it. The priests whispered about signs of omens and cosmic thresholds. They argued quietly but urgently, trying to interpret the meaning behind the reactivated relics and the resonance that had rippled through the earth. Many feared the object was not merely watching but waiting, as though anticipating a response from something ancient buried beneath their feet. At ground level, the effects of the pulse became even more apparent. In the lower city of Uruk, cracks appeared in the walls of older dwellings, fine hairline fractures that curved in geometric arcs instead of natural spirals. These lines seemed to reflect patterns seen in the momentary expansion of the star, suggesting a correspondence between its internal design and the structures within the earth. Scribes sketched these patterns obsessively, noting their unnatural symmetry. Some attempted to map them, discovering that the fractures aligned with the orientation of forgotten pathways buried beneath the city. These were not random breaks, but deliberate echoes. In Eridu, more unsettling signs emerged. The cracked stele uncovered during the resonance revealed additional carvings once shielded by centuries of silence, symbols that appeared to depict a sequence of descending forms, beams of light entering the earth, and a central figure standing between heaven and the underworld. This figure was neither Anunnaki nor human, but something ambiguous, elongated, faceless, and surrounded by concentric circles. The elders who examined the carving recoiled at its unfamiliarity. It represented a being belonging to neither pantheon nor known mythic lineage. Its presence suggested that the Anunnaki themselves may have been interacting with powers beyond their dominion. The fissure that had long been sealed remained closed after the resonance, yet the land around it vibrated faintly, as though breathing. Local villagers reported hearing soft, rhythmic pulses rising from the ground at dusk, gentle, measured, and unmistakably synchronized with the dimming and brightening of the star overhead. This rhythm was neither random nor seismic. It was communication. The earth was answering. Meanwhile, reports spread of strange experiences among the populace. People claimed their dreams were no longer abstract visions, but coherent messages filled with symbols identical to those etched on ancient tablets. Shepherds recounted hearing melodies without instruments, harmonies drifting across the plains like distant singing from deep beneath the soil. Children in several cities awoke speaking languages they did not know, uttering fragments of old Sumerian phrases long extinct even among scribes. One phrase recurred across different locations, whispered by dreamers and inscribed spontaneously by trembling hands. The threshold widens. The priests of Nippur struggled to interpret this warning, for among their oldest, most concealed texts existed a tablet that spoke of the widening threshold, a moment when the barrier between realms thinned so greatly that forces from both above and below could cross freely. According to the text, this phenomenon marked the beginning of an age of upheaval, an era when the heavens re-examined the earth and the deep places stirred with memory. The priests had always believed this tablet was symbolic, an esoteric teaching meant for meditation. Now, confronted with its possible literal manifestation, they felt a collective dread. As the day progressed, new anomalies appeared. Metallic objects buried beneath temple floors began to resonate, producing soft harmonics when touched. Seals and amulets carved with celestial symbols warmed against the skin. Clay tablets stored for generations grew brittle or warm without cause. And in certain regions, pools of water began to ripple in perfect geometric patterns, responding to vibrations that were imperceptible to the human ear. All of these signs pointed to a single conclusion. The star's pulse had awakened something dormant in the material world, something tied to the architecture of ancient power. The emerging picture was complex. The Anunnaki had not simply left Earth. They may have sealed systems, mechanisms, or sentinels intended to remain inert in their absence. The wandering star's arrival had reactivated these structures, bypassing the barriers established by the gods themselves. And if the carved stele was correct, the Anunnaki had once interacted with other forces whose nature and origin lay outside the familiar celestial order. The implications were staggering. Earth had once been part of a broader cosmic network, its history shaped not only by the sky beings remembered in Sumerian myth, but by deeper, older powers tied to the planet itself. As twilight returned and the wandering star brightened again, observers noticed that its light now pulsed faintly, not at random, but in sequences resembling a coded message. The pulses matched the rhythm emanating from the sealed fissure, creating a dialogue between sky and soil. It was a connection no one could deny, though its meaning remained hidden. Some believed the star was beckoning whatever lay beneath the earth to rise. Others feared it was reawakening something the Anunnaki had sacrificed much to bury. Near sunset, the priests of gathered for an emergency rite, attempting to stabilize the city's energy using ancient chants designed to restore equilibrium. As they began, a sudden wind swept through the courtyard despite the still air. The wandering star pulsed sharply in response, and the ground beneath the ziggurat vibrated. Several priests collapsed, overcome by visions. Those who remained conscious reported seeing an immense shadow rising beneath the earth, featureless, formless, but ancient. They felt its awareness brush against their minds like a cold current. The message was clear, though no words were spoken. The reactivation had begun a process that could not be reversed. And as darkness settled over the land, the wandering star glowed with increasing intensity, preparing for its next move, a move that would determine whether the balance between realms would hold or collapse entirely as the threshold continued to widen. Night settled over the cities of Sumer with an unease so palpable that even the wind seemed unwilling to cross the thresholds of doorways. Families gathered inside their homes, whispering prayers from generations past, while the wandering star hovered motionless above the horizon, its pale glow the only constant in a world tipping toward the unknown. Though it remained silent, its presence carried weight, as though the sky itself were holding its breath, waiting for the next sign. For the first time since the flood ages, humanity felt watched not with the familiar authority of the Anunnaki, but with an intent that was colder, older, and more distant from human understanding. By midnight, the pulses resumed. Unlike the sharp resonance of the previous night, these were softer, subtler, almost like a heartbeat. They occurred in intervals too precise to be natural, sending faint vibrations through stone, soil, and flesh. People awoke abruptly, gasping as if startled by an unseen hand. Children cried without knowing why. Animals bolted from their enclosures, breaking ropes and scattering across the plains. The sky's pulse echoed through the land, and the land responded in kind, creating a synchronized rhythm that unsettled every living being. In the high temple of Nippur, the oldest priest, nearly blind with age, declared that the pulses corresponded to a pattern he had once studied in forbidden tablets. These tablets, written in the archaic dialect of the first scribes, described an ancient communication system used before kingship was lowered from heaven. According to the text, the pulses were part of a calibration sequence, a method by which the sky and the earth aligned to open pathways between realms. The priest's declaration terrified the younger clerics, who had assumed such texts were metaphorical relics of a mythic age. Now, confronted with their possible literal meaning, they found themselves kneeling in trembling reverence. But not all reactions were rooted in fear. Some among the intellectual castes, scribes, astronomers, and stewards, began considering what the pulses implied. If the star was communicating with something beneath the earth, then the buried systems activated by the resonance might represent technology or intelligence far older than the Anunnaki. The idea contradicted every teaching passed down by their ancestors, yet the evidence was too overwhelming to ignore. The fissures vibrating in geometric patterns, the relics warming inexplicably, the dreams shared across entire cities. These pointed toward a unified system reawakening after dormancy. The fissure itself began to change. Though still sealed, the ground around it softened, as if the earth beneath had begun to shift. Strange vapors, thin, pale, and shimmering, escaped through minuscule cracks, leaving a metallic scent in the air. Villagers who inhaled the vapors reported feeling disoriented, overwhelmed by flashes of images, spirals that twisted impossibly, vast chambers filled with humming light, and silhouettes of beings whose forms could not be held in memory. Many collapsed from the intensity, recounting their visions only in broken fragments. Yet the messages they conveyed shared an eerie consistency, suggesting the phenomenon was no hallucination. In another development emerged. The fused glass segments that had reacted to the earlier pulse began glowing softly at the edges, emitting faint but steady lines of blue-white light. When mapped carefully, these illuminated sections formed pathways, lines that stretched across the city, pointing toward the ancient riverbed where the Anunnaki were said to have first arrived. This discovery threw the Temple Council into chaos. Were these lines remnants of an ancient grid system, or were they newly activated routes connecting specific points tied to buried mechanisms? The possibility that the Anunnaki had embedded deeper systems beneath the cities they founded shook even the most devout. In Lagash, fishermen reported that the waters near the riverbank vibrated with low hums, forming ripples that spread in unnaturally straight lines. This pattern repeated throughout the night, creating a lattice of waves that converged toward the central plateau. The elders recalled a legend describing the paths of the deep, ancient lines that once carried energy between earth and sky. Most had dismissed the story as metaphor. Now it seemed less like myth and more like memory. As the pulses continued, scholars noticed another alarming phenomenon. The constellations visible in the night sky shifted slightly, not dramatically, but enough that skilled observers recognized the change. Stars, once firmly anchored in familiar positions, wavered as though the fabric of the heavens had been subtly tugged. Some astronomers believed the wandering star was distorting perception. Others feared it was influencing gravitational forces. Whatever the cause, the sky felt unstable, as if responding to a command originating from the glowing object. At the same moment, deep beneath the Earth, something answered that command. The rhythmic pulses emanating from the fissure grew stronger, and the surrounding ground began to warm. Metal objects buried for generations surfaced through the soil, rising slowly as though pulled upward by invisible hands. These objects were not tools or weapons, but smooth, geometric pieces carved with symbols that matched those seen within the brief expansion of the star. They appeared to be fragments of a system long disconnected, and now, piece by piece, reassembling itself under the star's guidance. Priests attempted to halt the rising artifacts by performing protective rites, but the objects remained untouched by ritual energies. This failure marked a terrifying realization. Whatever intelligence governed the reactivation was beyond the influence of the gods the priests served. Not even the ancient chants of Enlil or the protective invocations of Enki produced any measurable effect. The power now stirring in the land acknowledged no command from the divine order known to humanity. As the night deepened, the pulses shifted again, merging into a continuous resonant hum. The wandering star brightened to its highest intensity yet, flooding the earth with cold, silvery light. Shadows disappeared entirely. Time seemed to stretch and compress, creating a strange, dream-like quality to every movement. People found themselves disoriented, uncertain whether moments or hours had passed. Then, without warning, the star emitted a final, elongated pulse that silenced everything. The hum, the vibrations, the whispers of wind. Even insects ceased their movements. For a single breath, the world stood suspended. In that silence, a new sound emerged. It was faint, distant, and rising from beneath the earth, a deep echoing tone like the slow turning of colossal gears. The fissure throbbed in response, sending ripples across the land. The light of the star intensified once more, illuminating the world with a blinding brilliance. The threshold had widened to its limit. Something was about to cross, and neither the gods of old nor the surviving humans of Sumer could predict what awaited on the other side. The brilliance that followed was unlike anything recorded in the memories of the elders or etched into the most ancient tablets. It did not flare like lightning or burn like fire. Instead, it expanded in perfect stillness, as though the sky itself had opened into a new dimension. For a heartbeat, the world was flooded with a cold, luminous clarity that sharpened every edge, revealing textures and contours normally hidden from mortal sight. Stones appeared to vibrate with subtle patterns, as if etched with invisible glyphs. The air shimmered like a taut veil stretched thin between realms. And beneath the earth, the deep tone continued to rise, slow and deliberate, as though something vast and ancient had begun to move after millennia of silence. When the blinding glow faded, the wandering star no longer hovered in stillness. It had begun to change. The once perfect sphere pulsed with internal light, revealing layers of geometric structures shifting within it like gears in a colossal machine. Observers who dared to stare directly at it described shapes that seemed to fold in and out of existence, impossible architectures that defied all earthly logic. Some saw angular forms reminiscent of the carvings found in sealed chambers beneath the oldest temples. Others claimed the star's inner movements resembled the spirals and lattice patterns etched into the newly risen artifacts. It was as though the sky and the earth were mirroring each other, reflecting a single, unified design. Across the cities, people gathered in stunned silence. Children clung to their parents. Traders abandoned their stalls. Entire villages stood motionless, their faces lit by the cold glow overhead. For the first time in generations, humanity felt the presence of an intelligence that did not belong to myth or distant memory. It was immediate, undeniable, and and disquieting, something watching with a purpose no mortal priest could decipher. The feeling settled over the land like an invisible weight. Even those with no understanding of omens sensed that the boundaries separating the world from the unknown had thinned to a dangerous degree. It was then that the earth answered again. A deep tremor rippled through the plains, not violent, but rhythmic, like the steady exhalation of a giant awakening beneath layers of stone. From the fissure's border, thin beams of pale light erupted upward, silent, narrow, and perfectly vertical. These beams did not flicker or waver. They formed a cage of light descending into the depths, illuminating stone walls carved with symbols unseen for ages. The ground around the fissure vibrated with increasing intensity, producing a low hum that resonated within the bones of every living creature. It was not the erratic shaking of seismic activity, but the controlled activation of a system designed with unfathomable precision. The priests watched in horror as the beams intensified, forming a dome of luminescence around the sealed crevice. Their attempts to invoke divine intervention grew desperate. Ritual chants dissolved into frightened whispers. Offerings were scattered across the temple floors, yet no divine presence answered their pleas, not even in the faintest whisper. It was as though the familiar gods had withdrawn entirely, leaving humanity alone at the threshold of an ancient event they had never meant to witness. Meanwhile, in distant settlements, shepherds reported seeing the ground pulse with faint patterns, circular motions expanding outward like ripples frozen in time. These patterns aligned with the luminous grid spreading from the fissure, suggesting a far-reaching network beneath the surface. In marshlands near the Tigris, reeds bent uniformly, pointing toward the horizon where the wandering star glowed. Even in remote mountain outposts, travelers witnessed strange arcs of light tracing the contours of the valleys below, as if outlining forgotten pathways buried beneath layers of soil and water. One disturbing discovery emerged from the city of Kish, where the ruins of an ancient observatory revealed carvings long thought eroded by time. Under the influence of the star's illumination, the carvings reactivated, emitting faint glows along their etched lines. Scholars who examined them realized the patterns represented a sequence, a series of transitions marking shifts in cosmic influence over the Earth. According to the sequence, humanity was entering the next phase of an ancient cycle, one associated with the opening of thresholds rather than their sealing. The revelation sent shockwaves through the academic circles of Sumer. If the carvings were accurate, then the fissure was not merely a crack in the earth, but a designed interface, one that connected the realm of the Anunnaki with the deeper powers entombed in the planet. The wandering star's reactivation implied that this interface was awakening, responding to a signal older than the very cities built upon it. And then came the whispering. It began as a faint sensation, like wind brushing the edges of the mind rather than the ear. People turned their heads instinctively, trying to locate the source, but no sound touched the physical world. Instead, the whispers echoed internally, soft, layered, and speaking in a language no one recognized, but everyone felt they somehow understood. The words carried a tone of warning, or perhaps invitation, rippling through consciousness like a distant memory rising from the depths. Some people cried out and covered their ears. Others froze in trance-like silence. A few began reciting phrases involuntarily, strings of sounds that matched nothing in known Sumerian dialects. Scribes recorded these utterances hastily, recognizing them as fragments of the same archaic language found on the forbidden tablets hidden in temple vaults. The whispers intensified, weaving through thoughts like threads of an ancient code, awakening memories humanity never knew it carried. The priests, desperate for control, attempted to shield the people with ceremonial barriers, circles of salt, sacred symbols drawn in ash, chants invoking the authority of the sky gods. But none of these protections had any effect. The phenomenon passed through every barrier with ease, indifferent to the rituals that had once shaped the fate of nations. As the whispers reached their peak, the wandering star dimmed suddenly, compressing into a narrow column of light that extended downward, aligning perfectly with the beams rising from the fissure. The world seemed to tilt, not physically but perceptually, as though both realms, sky and earth, were converging upon a single point. A gust of wind swept across the plains, cold and electric, and then, in the deepest silence the land had ever known, a faint silhouette appeared within the descending light. Neither human nor Anunnaki, neither beast nor spirit. It was something else entirely, something the ancient tablets had feared enough to erase. The threshold had opened, and what stepped through would redefine everything humanity believed about its past, its gods, and its place in the cosmos. The silhouette within the column of light did not move at first. It hovered in place, suspended between worlds, as though deciding whether the realm it was entering still belonged to the living. The figure's outline shifted, flickering like a reflection seen across rippling water. Some observers swore it possessed wings, tall, arching structures that folded and unfolded with mechanical precision. Others insisted it was humanoid, though taller and unusually slender, with limbs that seemed jointed in too many places. A few described it as nothing but a pillar of shadow braided with strands of light. The truth was impossible to grasp, for the form changed subtly with each breath of the watching crowd. Yet one detail remained constant. The figure radiated a presence older than the first brick laid in Uruk, older even than the memory of the Anunnaki themselves. As it stabilized, the column of light began to contract around it, concentrating into patterns that spiraled up its body like luminous serpents. These spirals pulsed in rhythms that resonated through the ground beneath everyone's feet. The air grew heavy, and the tremor in the earth deepened, not chaotic, but deliberate, synchronized with the being's breath. A sense of watching intelligence washed over the people, a consciousness ancient enough to see them not as individuals, but as a single collective organism witnessing an event beyond comprehension. The priests were the first to break the stillness. Summoning every ounce of courage, the high priest of Nippur stepped forward and shouted a command, an invocation demanding the entity identify itself and state its purpose. But the being did not respond. Instead, the faint whispers that had crawled through the people's minds faded into a profound silence, a silence that felt sentient. Moments later, the figure lifted one of its elongated arms, or what resembled an arm, and pointed toward the ground. The fissure responded immediately. Its beams flared brighter, then split, forming rings of light that rotated slowly around the opening. The ground crackled with a lattice of glowing lines, stretching outward in perfect geometry. Circles, triangles, spirals, each one interlocking with the next. The design resembled ancient sigils found on forbidden tablets, symbols too advanced for the early Sumerians to fully translate. Then the light shifted. The patterns flowed together, forming a single glyph large enough to engulf the entire plaza. Those who recognized its shape gasped in horror. It was the mark of the Deep Gate, a symbol that appeared only in the most restricted Anunnaki records, transcribed reluctantly by scribes who feared the consequences of copying its form. The Deep Gate was not a portal used by gods, nor by mortals. It was a seal, a boundary marker created to confine something beneath the earth, something not meant to walk among the living. And now that seal was opening. As the glowing glyph pulsed, the wandering star above shifted its trajectory. No longer hovering, it began descending, slowly, steadily, its light dimming with each meter it approached the earth. The sky darkened, but not with clouds. Instead, the atmosphere itself seemed to thicken, turning the daylight into a metallic twilight. Birds stopped mid-flight. Animals collapsed. Even the insects fell into an unnatural stillness. Time itself felt like it had slowed, every second stretching into the next with unnatural elasticity. Fear spread through the crowd. Families clutched one another. Warriors gripped their spears tighter, though no weapon made by human hands could affect the phenomenon unfolding before them. The priests attempted another invocation, but their voices faltered, choked by the weight of a presence that rendered language itself inadequate. When the wandering star reached the height of a tall ziggurat, its shell suddenly fractured, not violently, but like a flower unfolding under moonlight. Its luminous exterior peeled back in symmetrical layers, revealing an interior chamber filled with swirling particles of golden mist. Suspended within that chamber were black, stone-like objects, fragments shaped like broken tablets, or shards of some greater monolith. One of the shards drifted downward. As it floated into the world, the entity within the column of light extended its arm again. The shard halted mid-air and began to rotate, emitting a deep, resonant tone that vibrated through the stones beneath the crowd's feet. When the shard aligned with the entity, the glyph on the ground shifted once more, this time transforming into a spiral with concentric rings rotating at different speeds. Suddenly, memories surged through the minds of every person present. Images, sensations, echoes of a time long before the written word. They saw a civilization unlike anything they had imagined. Cities built with architecture that resonated like musical instruments, towers that harnessed atmospheric energy, knowledge flowing through crystal conduits, and beings of great stature walking among mortals. They saw the Anunnaki, arriving not as creators, but as custodians, responding to a catastrophe triggered by something older than themselves. They saw the deep gate being sealed. They saw the same glyph glowing beneath a world wrapped in shadow. They saw humanity reset. Then, as quickly as the memories appeared, they vanished. People collapsed to their knees, weeping, gasping for breath, clutching their heads in confusion and awe. Some began chanting fragments of forgotten languages. Others stared blankly at the ground, unable to comprehend what they had witnessed. The entity finally moved. Its form coalesced, no longer shifting, no longer blurred. A towering humanoid figure stood before them, its body wrapped in interlocking plates of obsidian-like material that pulsed faintly with internal luminescence. Its face was featureless, yet everyone who looked upon it felt unmistakably that it was aware of them, evaluating them. And then, in a voice that echoed not through the air, but through the mind, it spoke a single word: threshold. The ground shook, the glyph blazed, the deep gate opened wider. Something else was coming, something that had not stepped into this world since long before the Anunnaki arrived, something that had been buried and intentionally forgotten. And the being standing before humanity was not here to conquer, but to warn. The true danger had not yet emerged. The word hung in the minds of the crowd like a tremor that refused to fade. Threshold. It echoed through their thoughts, slipping past language, past meaning, until it reached a place deeper than reason, an instinctual place where dread and recognition intertwined. As the sound dissipated, the ground beneath the glowing glyph began to shift. The luminous spiral contracted, each ring tightening as though preparing to unwind with unimaginable force. Dust rose in thin, trembling lines from the fissure, pulled upward by the energy gathering below. The air no longer merely vibrated, it throbbed, pulsing like a heartbeat tied to something beneath the earth. The entity stepped forward. Its movements were graceful yet unsettling, each stride unnaturally smooth, as though unbound by the resistance of physical space. When its foot touched the edge of the glyph, the rotating rings slowed, responding not with chaos but obedience. The patterns adjusted themselves to accommodate the being's presence, shifting in intricate geometries that no human mathematician would decode for another 1,000 years. These symbols were not written, they were alive, reacting to the consciousness that had just stepped into their sequence. Then the entity lowered its arm, and the shard suspended above the crowd responded instantly. It descended until it hovered directly above the glyph's center, its surface glowing with a dark gold radiance. Symbols appeared across the shard, not carved, but etched in light, lines, curves, spirals, and unfamiliar sigils that shimmered like molten metal. These symbols did not resemble the languages known to ancient Sumer, yet the priests felt a strange compulsion to bow. They recognized, without understanding how, that the shard contained a record, a message, a memory older than their own gods. The entity raised its head. The air tightened, as if the atmosphere itself braced for something immense. Then the ground split wider, revealing chambers of stone beneath the fissure, chambers cut with impossible precision, their walls wrapped in glowing patterns that pulsed like veins infused with light. A cold wind rushed upward, carrying with it a scent unlike anything the people had known, something metallic, ancient, and electric. The crowd recoiled, stepping backward, though no one dared to flee. Curiosity held them in place. Fear locked them there. And something deeper, a sense that what they were witnessing was not simply an event, but a turning of the world. The shard released a vibrant chord, a sound that resonated through bone and memory alike. Visions erupted within the minds of all who stood near the plaza. They saw a vast world, not the crude simplicity of their earliest cities, but a realm of luminous architecture, curving towers, suspended bridges, and complex energy networks radiating like a cosmic lattice. They saw beings, tall, radiant figures, walking among humans not as deities, but as mentors. They saw knowledge shared freely, entire regions flourishing without war or famine, children raised in harmony with forces of nature that later civilizations would merely fear. Then they saw the fall. A wave of darkness sweeping across the horizon, towers collapsing as pressure rippled through the air, distorting structures that once hummed with power. The ground cracking open, light dimming, the energy grid shattering. A fissure, a gate, opening where it should never have opened. And from that gate came not creatures, but forces, invisible yet devastating. Forces that silenced entire cities without leaving bodies behind. Forces that unraveled the breath of adults while sparing the lungs of children. Forces that broke the world. The people watching the visions collapsed. Some screamed, others sobbed. A few simply stared upward, their minds splintered by the revelation of a civilization erased long before their own. As the visions receded, the shard dimmed, and the entity turned its head toward the descending star. The chamber within it swirled with golden particles, particles that suddenly funneled downward into the fissure, drawn toward the awakening glyph. As they descended, the patterns reacted, changing once again into a form that resembled a vast, spiraling key. The entity's voice filled every mind at once. "The seal weakens!" A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. "The cycle returns!" A cold realization dawned in the minds of the priests. This was not the first time a threshold had opened. These symbols, this gate, this being, it all echoed a distant memory buried in the genetic marrow of humanity. A cycle older than written history, a sequence of collapse and rebirth recorded only in myths and half-remembered creation stories. The entity continued. Only those who remember survive. The priests shuddered, for they did not understand what must be remembered. Then the fissure erupted, not with fire, not with dust, but with a radiant pulse of light that expanded outward in a perfect sphere. The shockwave lifted the crowd from their feet, though it did not burn or break. Instead, it imprinted something inside them, a pattern, a mark, an echo of a memory they did not yet know how to interpret. When the sphere collapsed back into the fissure, a rumbling groan rose from the deep earth, a sound that felt like the awakening of something not yet seen. The entity stepped back and spoke a final message. "Prepare the remembrance, the lost return." Before anyone could react, the glyph flared once more. The rings expanded outward, then folded inward like a collapsing star. The shard dissolved into particles of gold, and the entity began to ascend, its form flickering, fracturing into strands of light. The wandering star brightened. The deep gate pulsed, and in the trembling silence that followed, the priests understood what the being had not said. Whatever was sealed beneath the earth was beginning to rise again. The silence that followed was not a silence of peace, but a silence of pressure. A silence stretched tight over the plaza like the skin of a drum ready to break. The entity's departing light had barely faded before the ground beneath the crowd shifted again, this time with a deeper, heavier resonance, an echo that seemed to originate from a depth no human had ever imagined. People staggered, clutching one another, staring at the sealed glyph as if expecting it to burst open at any moment. Even the priests, who moments earlier stood with ceremonial confidence, now trembled like children, waking from a nightmare too real to dismiss. Above them, the wandering star continued its slow descent across the sky. Its light grew denser, richer, as if thickening with purpose. The shimmering particles within the star churned faster, forming patterns that spiraled outward in perfect geometry. Every instinct among the watchers screamed that this was not simply a celestial phenomenon. It was intentional, directed, alive. The high priest stepped forward, his voice cracking as he whispered to no one in particular, "The remembrance. What must be remembered?" His question hung in the air, unanswered, yet it triggered something in the minds of the elders. Fragmented memories, visions glimpsed in dreams, symbols carved on ancient tablets long before their time, stories whispered by grandparents about eras when gods walked among men, began to surface like forgotten bones rising through the soil. It became clear that the event unfolding was not new. It was a return, a continuation of a cycle interrupted by the flood of mud, by the collapse of towers, by the disappearance of adults in ages past. A cycle buried beneath centuries of rewritten history. A murmuring spread through the crowd as shapes appeared within the wandering star. At first, they seemed like shadows, then silhouettes, tall forms with elongated limbs and flowing garments that shimmered like liquid metal. Their faces could not be seen, yet their presence filled the air with a sensation of memory, not personal memory, but ancestral, as if humanity itself recognized them. One of the figures extended an arm toward the earth. The gesture was subtle, almost gentle, yet the ground responded violently. The fissure widened, spiraling outward in a pattern identical to the glyph's earlier formation. Dust rose in a circular plume. Loose stones vibrated against each other like teeth chattering. The priests scrambled backward, some falling to their knees, tears streaming down their faces. A low hum began to rise from below, soft at first, then escalating into a deep resonance that vibrated through the bones of everyone present. The hum was familiar in a way that terrified them. It was the same hum described in generations-old nightmares, in the secret writings of forgotten scribes, in the memories of survivors who could never fully articulate what they had seen. It was the sound of the world before the world they knew. The sound of a civilization erased but not extinct. The star beings, if they could be called that, moved closer to the threshold between heaven and earth. Their forms fractured into luminous strands, weaving themselves into the fissure as though forming a bridge between realms. As the strands descended, the hum intensified, reaching a frequency that made vision blur and breath grow shallow. Some villagers collapsed. Others clamped their hands over their ears, though it did nothing to dull the resonance. It was not a sound one heard. It was a sound one experienced. The fissure glowed, the earth pulsed, and then, emerging from the spiraling light, came the first shape. It resembled a human child, small, slight, clothed in garments that shimmered like woven starlight. The crowd gasped and recoiled, not from fear, but from recognition. They had seen these children before, not in their lifetimes, but in the stories of their ancestors. The green children of Woolpit, the the phantom children who emerged from caverns after earthquakes, the strange orphans found wandering the countryside after storms that should not have existed. This child bore the same otherworldly presence, the same disorientation, the same haunting calm. The child stepped onto the earth, blinking at the brightness, as though seeing daylight for the first time. Behind him, another child emerged, then another and another. Soon, the threshold was filled with small figures, dozens at first, then hundreds, each stepping cautiously onto the plaza as though waking from a long, dark dream. The priests stared in disbelief. These children did not speak the local tongue, yet their eyes carried the same silent question. Where are the adults? The same question that had echoed through the orphan trains centuries later. The same question whispered by the green children when they emerged from Woolpit. This was the pattern repeating. The wandering star continued its descent, and the crowd began to realize the truth. These children were not arriving from the heavens. They were returning from below, from the chambers sealed beneath the earth, from the remnants of a world lost long before Sumer rose from the mud. The entity's message echoed in their minds. Only those who remember survive. As more children emerged, the fissure trembled again. This time, the tremor carried with it a warning, a sound like stone grinding against stone, a deep rumbling that hinted at colossal movement below. The priests clutched their staves and looked toward the wandering star, which was now aligning perfectly with the spiraling glyph on the ground, forming a radiant pathway between sky and soil. The air darkened, the hum deepened, something vast stirred beneath their feet, and the people understood, with dawning horror, that the return of the children was not the end of the threshold. It was only the beginning of what was coming through next. The trembling intensified until every stone beneath the plaza quivered like a living thing. The children, dozens of them, gathered instinctively near one another, forming small clusters as though guided by a shared instinct older than language. Their eyes remained fixed on the luminous fissure behind them, a doorway that was still open, still active, still humming with a resonance that reached into the marrow of every person who stood witnessing this impossible moment. The villagers, priests, and elders could only watch in stunned silence as the wandering star above reached perfect alignment with the glowing spiral at their feet. A thin column of light descended from the star, connecting sky to earth in a single continuous beam. Its brilliance was not blinding, yet it demanded reverence. Within its radiance, shapes moved, slow, deliberate, graceful. They did not emerge fully, not yet. Instead, their silhouettes hovered at the threshold between worlds, as if evaluating the conditions of the realm they were about to enter. The children turned toward the light, many raising their hands as though greeting familiar guardians rather than strange visitors. Their expressions shifted from fear to recognition, and the shift rippled like a silent communication across their entire group. The high priest took a hesitant step forward. His voice trembled as he spoke, more to himself than to anyone else. "These are the survivors," he whispered. "These are the ones who endured the last collapse." His words sent a wave of unease through the onlookers. A last collapse. The implication lingered, heavy and undeniable. If there had been a collapse before, there could be another now, perhaps several. Perhaps countless cycles had already risen and fallen, their traces lost to mud, fire, and the rewriting of memories. The wandering star vibrated with increasing intensity, its interior swirling faster and faster until it resembled a vast celestial vortex. More silhouettes took shape within it, taller, more defined, their contours shimmering with geometric patterns too perfect to be natural. The air grew warmer. The wind slowed to a standstill. The sounds of the world, rustling leaves, distant animal calls, even the breath of the crowd, seemed to flatten into silence. Something monumental was approaching, something that did not belong to the present age. The fissure expanded again. Its edges glowed with a white heat, and fragments of earth levitated inches above the ground as though the laws of gravity were being rewritten. The priests bowed their heads, overwhelmed by the pressure that pressed against their hearts. The children, however, remained upright, calm, observant, as though remembering a lesson once forgotten. A low vibration rippled through the ground. It was not the harsh rumble of an earthquake, but a steady pulse, one that synced with the rhythm of their own hearts. Some villagers clutched their chests, startled by the sensation. A few fell to their knees, overwhelmed by the overwhelming presence radiating through the plaza. The high priest's staff clattered from his shaking hand, the carved symbols on its surface reacting to the pulsating light. Then, slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, a new structure began to rise from the fissure, an enormous geometric form that appeared to be neither fully solid nor fully ethereal. It rose like an ancient monument, being lifted from beneath the soil by unseen hands, its surfaces adorned with metallic inlays that reflected the wandering star's light in intricate patterns. The structure seemed to be composed of concentric rings stacked upward, each ring rotating independently with a precision that suggested a design far beyond human capability. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Some villagers stepped back in terror. Others leaned forward, unable to look away. The rotating rings emitted a harmonic hum that resonated with the children, who responded instinctively. Several of them stepped toward the structure, drawn to it as though it were a home they no longer remembered. One of the youngest, a girl with wide, luminous eyes, placed her small hand upon the lowest ring. The hum deepened immediately, shifting into a new frequency that rippled across the plaza and through the bodies of everyone present. Elders cried out in shock. The priests retreated in fear, yet the children moved closer, unafraid. Then something astonishing happened. The structure responded to the children, reshaping itself. The metallic rings adjusted their spin, aligning in a pattern that formed a single open archway. A radiant mist flowed from the arch like living air. Within the mist, shadowed figures moved. Those same silhouettes glimpsed inside the wandering star. They approached the threshold, but did not cross. The high priest sputtered a warning, but his voice was swallowed by the pulsing hum. A young boy, perhaps 7 or 8 years old, turned toward the crowd for the first time. His gaze was steady, ancient, and filled with a clarity no child should possess. When he spoke, his voice was soft but carried with it the weight of memory. "They cannot return," he said quietly. "Not yet." The villagers froze. The high priest, trembling, whispered, "Who cannot return?" The boy lifted his eyes toward the wandering star. "The ones who went before. The ones who guarded us when the world fell." His words seemed to resonate within the minds of the crowd, each syllable sinking deeper than sound alone could reach. Another child stepped forward, a girl slightly older, her voice blending with the boy's as though completing a single shared thought. "They come only to awaken what sleeps." As if in response, the structure vibrated again. The archway widened, revealing a glimpse of an impossible landscape beyond. Towers of light, spiraling platforms, and a sky that shimmered with colors not found in this world. It was a vision of a civilization too advanced to belong to the present, yet too familiar to be imagined. A murmur spread through the villagers. Fear, awe, disbelief. The children pointed toward the vision. "This was home," one whispered. "And this will be again," another added. But before anyone could speak, the wandering star dimmed. The silhouettes retreated. The fissure trembled with new instability, and the structure beneath began to sink as though being pulled back into the depths. The brief window between worlds was closing, but not before one final revelation, one that would change everything the witnesses believed about their past and their future. The humming from the structure deepened until it reached a tone so low it was felt more than heard, vibrating through every rib, every tooth, every hidden memory held within the Watchers. The concentric rings slowed, then rotated in reverse, their metallic surfaces glowing with an inner fire that flickered like the remnants of a dying star. The children backed away from the threshold, their expressions shifting from recognition to sorrow, as if they knew this moment, this connection between worlds, was not meant to last. The archway dimmed, the radiant mist thinned. The silhouettes within took one final step backward into the swirling brilliance of the wandering star. And then, in a motion as elegant as it was final, the aperture sealed shut, leaving behind only a faint shimmer in the air, an echo of a doorway that had never fully belonged to this realm. A tremor rolled across the plaza. The structure sank, ring by ring, the metallic surfaces rippling as though dissolving into liquid light. The ground swallowed the monument with gentle finality. No violence, no collapse, only a deliberate descent as though the earth itself were reclaiming something sacred. Within moments, the plaza was bare again, save for a faint spiral etched into the stone, warmer than the ground around it and pulsing softly like the last heartbeat of a fading world. Silence followed, not the tense, expectant silence that had preceded the event, but a heavy, contemplative quiet, a silence that carried the weight of revelation. The villagers stared at the spot where the impossible structure had stood. Some wept openly. Others dropped to their knees in prayer, unable to comprehend what they had witnessed. The high priest stepped forward, trembling, his voice barely a whisper. The past has returned to remind us, but the children understood more than he did. One of the oldest, no more than 12, turned her face toward the sky, where the wandering star's light was beginning to fade into the pale dawn. Her eyes shimmered with tears, yet her voice was steady as she spoke. "They came to warn us." A chill spread through the crowd. "Warn us of what?" the priest managed, though he already feared the answer. The girl reached down and pressed her hand against the spiral etched into the stone. The pattern glowed faintly beneath her touch, as though responding to her presence. "Of the cycle," she said quietly. "The cycle that ended their world. The cycle that begins again." Whispers rippled through the villagers like wind through a field of dry grass. Mothers clutched their children. Elders bowed their heads. The priests exchanged terrified glances. No one dared to speak the fear that was blooming in every mind, that the catastrophe which had erased the civilization of the past, those mysterious beings, those forgotten architects of humming towers and white cities, was not an isolated event. It was a pattern repeating. The boy who had spoken earlier stepped forward again, his gaze steady. "The earth remembers," he said. "The sky remembers, and now we must remember too." He turned to the crowd, and his words carried an authority far beyond his young age. "You must learn what was forgotten. You must protect what they protected, because when the cycle turns again, it will not be the adults who survive." A collective gasp rose from the watchers. The memories of the orphan trains echoed like a distant storm. The green children of Woolpit, the wandering survivors of mud-choked cities, the unexplained influx of orphans centuries later. All pieces of the same story, scattered through time like shards of a broken mirror, reflecting a forgotten truth. One of the priests finally found his voice. "What begins again? What cycle is returning?" The boy turned his gaze toward the horizon, where a low haze shimmered over the distant hills. The same one that buried their towers, the same one that took their elders, the same one that drove us into the chambers below. His voice lowered to a whisper. The same one rising now. The villagers froze. For the first time they felt it too, the faint trembling underfoot, subtle yet persistent, as though the earth were exhaling after a long sleep. The sky above shimmered with a pale shimmer, a distortion that made the light bend at peculiar angles. The wind carried a faint metallic scent. Animals in the distance called out with uneasy cries, their instincts sensing what human minds still wanted to deny. The high priest stepped back, horror dawning in his eyes. "The reset," he whispered. The Great Reset the ancestors feared. The girl nodded. The one they tried to stop. The one they hid us from. The wandering star flickered as though acknowledging her words. People began to cry. Others stared in stunned disbelief. The world they thought they understood fractured in an instant, replaced by a truth older than history, older than their own bloodlines. The children they believed to be refugees, survivors, anomalies, were in fact the last living bridge to a civilization erased by a force beyond comprehension. And now the force was stirring again. The ground rumbled softly, the spiral at the children's feet glowing faintly once more. The hum that had been fading began to rise again, just perceptible enough to send shivers through every spine. The boy raised his voice one final time. You must prepare. You must listen. You must remember what was lost, because the threshold will open again. He turned toward the horizon, where the sky had begun to darken unnaturally. And this time, he whispered, the world must decide whether it will forget again or finally wake up. The wandering star dimmed completely, vanishing into the morning light. The children stood united, the ground trembled, and the new cycle began.